I'm Jonathan Tomkin from the University of Illinois. So we've looked at the past of Japan and used it to predict the future. Let's look at some other countries around the world. Here I'm going to show you some UN-generated data sets of population pyramids for countries at different stages in the demographic transition. This is a very youthful pyramid. Very youthful pyramids tend to be splayed out at the base. So they're not exactly pyramid shaped, they're not like triangles. And this indicates that there's a lot of potential for future population growth because there's lots of people who haven't entered the fertility ages yet. There's people below the age of 15. So Afghanistan, which we've already discussed, has a very high fertility rate, has this splayed out structure at the base. Here male is shown in the blue and female in the yellow. And you can see that there's a very large group of people in those slightly lighter colours, which indicates people who are just entering or pre the family building stage. And so there's a lot of potential here for the population to increase. A more classic pyramid structure might be a place like the Philippines. It's still very youthful. In this case, we describe it as a youthful population pyramid. But in this case, the pyramid is not splayed at the base. It's a little bit flatter. And in fact, you can actually see that the age groups of 0 to 4 and 5 to 9 are actually pretty similar to one another. And so this is suggesting that perhaps the Philippines is also entering a stage of demographic transition. Transitional countries, and the United States is a good example of that, still experience some population growth. So they haven't gone through the whole demographic transition period to stage 4. Fertility rates are still higher than death rates. But if you look at the younger age groups, you can see that there's that start of that flat structure. So we no longer have that wide pyramid base. Instead, as we see in this example from Mexico, we see that the age groups between 0 and 5, 5 and 10, up to 20 in this case, are very flat and stable. And so this is suggesting that in the future we'll be moving towards one of those more stable populations where death rates and fertility rates are the same. Other countries have gone through this process, and we've looked at Japan. Another good example is Germany. Germany has that wedge or cup-shaped, and so we call this a mature country. These mature countries are actually experiencing net population decreases. Some countries like Germany might also experience some immigration, which might balance that. But if we look at this just in terms of fertility versus death rates, we can see that the population of the future of Germany will be lower than it is today because there are far less people in the pre-family stage. There are far less people aged between 0 and 20 than there are aged at those older age groups. In particular, here we see for Germany that the biggest age groups are in the 40s. And so these are people who are leaving that family formation stage, who are leaving that additional birth stage. So the thing to watch out for mature countries is that the base of the pyramid is thinner. It's not as wide as for those older cohorts. So demographers use this to predict the future. This graph shows the yearly growth rate of the world population versus the year. Historically, we can see there's been a big change. There is quite a bit of variation early on, like just after the 60s. Again, we talked about the impact of cohort effects like Generation X, baby boomers and so on. But nevertheless, the world population growth today is about 1%, and it's been historically trending down. Based on what demographers know about world population shapes, they expect this trend to merely continue. Notice this means that by about the mid-century, population growth will be about half of what it is today. So the growth rate will have slowed from about 1% per year to about 0.5% per year. This is just the same as the sort of patterns we've seen in the past. If you look at this graph, you can see that around 1980, a little over 30 years ago, the world's population growth rate was almost double what it is today. It was about 1.8% per year. So the world seems to be on this path to lower and lower rates of yearly increase. This means, however, we will continue to see more and more people on Earth over the next few decades. Note the fattening of this pyramid over time. This shows the world population pyramid for 1950, 2010, and then projections for 2050 and the end of this century, 2100. So in the beginning, 1950, so this was over 60 years ago, we see a fairly classic shape. It's a wide base and it's very pyramidal. The world today is actually in a transitional shape. The base is quite fat, but it's also flat. So in other words, the people who are being born today, it's not very different from the number of people who were born 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But the population continues to increase even though this base does not continue to get fatter. If we look at the world in 2050, the number of people who are aged between 0 and 10 is about the same as today. The reason why there are going to be many more people is because less people are dying. So the reason why we're seeing this population growth rate around the world today is not because there's been going to be a jump in the number of people being born relative to today. It's just that the people who are being born are going to live, and they're going to live for longer. So in some ways, the world increase in population is a very hopeful thing because it indicates that people's lives are getting better, more secure and healthier. The predictions are very difficult beyond 2050 because there could be a lot of cultural changes, there could be technological changes. We can't make very firm predictions, and as we'll see, the United Nations has a range of ideas about what the world population might be at the end of this century. But if the world population of developing countries follows the same pattern that we saw in developed countries, we would expect to see this transition to a more mature age structure. And this means that we would get what we see here in 2050 and 2100, where we have this very flat block-shaped structure where the world population is relatively stable and death rates really have been abated until people reach old age. So the sorts of things that have killed people in the past, pandemics, communicable diseases, poor diets, lack of nutrition, are things that are being eliminated, and that is why people are living so much longer. And if this is the case, we would expect to see this flat, mature age structure. So the UN then has several different world population projections, and they depend on different presumptions. You can read more about this from the readings, but I'll tell you that the favoured model has about a century-end population, so that is the number of people at the end of this century of about 10 billion people. Don't forget there are 7 billion today. So that's a fairly significant increase. But the other thing that this favoured model, which is the orange line, if we look at this data set, we can see the sort of the historical trend data going back is the black, and then we have very good data in the blue, that's from the modern era, and then the three different colours, the red, yellow and green, are the different end member scenarios that the United Nations looked at. Their preferred model, the yellow model, growth really becomes flat by mid-century and the end of the century. So we might see a population of around 10 billion in 2050, and that population might not change through the end of the century. So this suggests, if we look at that yellow curve, which is their most favoured curve, that we'd have an S-shaped population growth pattern. So that's a stable population growth pattern that wouldn't have the opportunity to go through a crash, unless, of course, we're already beyond the world's carrying capacity. The red line assumes that population doesn't follow the trends that we've seen in the past, that fertility rates actually go up rather than come down in a lot of countries. And in this case, we might see 16 billion people at the end of the century. On the other hand, if the demographic transition is more aggressive, because we have this faster paced lifestyle in the 21st century than we had in the 20th century or the 19th, then it's possible that the population could continue to fall. This would imply that lots of countries follow the paths of Germany and Japan. They grow rich, people have few kids, and under this scenario we might expect less people at the end of the century than there are today, less than 7 billion. So there is a range of futures out there, but if we look at this, the most favoured model, the most predictions based on what we've observed so far over the last 100 years, would indicate that population will slowly increase, and this population increase will be largely due to extended life expectancies and not due to explosions in rates of births. I've spoken a lot about population growth. The one thing to be very aware of, and this is what all the demographers agree, is that it is not going to be even everywhere. Some countries will see significant population growth, and some countries will see no population growth or even a decline. Here we have data from 1950 and 2010 of the biggest countries in the world. So today, as was true in 1950, China has the highest population, that's the red line. And India has the second highest population. Between 1950 and 2010, both of these countries saw an enormous increase in the number of people. The third largest country is the United States, which also saw a significant increase in its population. And perhaps if you're not from one of those countries, your country is listed below. However, it is not expected that future population growth will follow the same pattern, because a lot of these countries have gone through demographic transitions. India is expected to continue to see significant population growth because it is yet to experience this demographic transition. China, on the other hand, has experienced a very significant demographic transition. In fact, birth rates in China today are below replacement rate. And so the world's most populous country is not expecting to see large increases in population in the future. If we look at other countries, such as the United States, a transitional country which has high immigration, we might see modest increases in future population. And for lots of other countries on this list, you will see that these populations don't increase, and that some otherwise significant countries, such as Russia or Germany, will drop out of this list of the largest world populations because they don't see big population growth, and in fact, in a lot of these countries, we see decline is expected over this coming century. I'd like to point out that China is a very good example of a country which is surprising in that we think of that as a developing country, but because it has passed through the demographic transition, we expect the population of China to be lower at the end of this century than it is today. Most of the world's population growth between today and the end of the century is predicted to occur in Africa. Let's look at this graph. Africa sees a net population increase over the 90 years between 2010 and 2100 of 2.5 billion. Other areas in the world, such as Latin America, North America, Asia, will see increases. Some of these will be relatively modest. Asia will see almost a 500 million increase, whereas other countries in places such as Europe in particular will see decreases. So there'll actually be less people in Europe at the end of the century than there is today, based on the demographic trends that we've spoken about in today's lecture. Given that the people of Africa are much poorer than most other places in the world, on average, and so consume less, it might be that unless there is significant catch-up economic growth, the impact of these additional people will be on the world environment will be lower than you might expect. I'll give you an example. Let's look at greenhouse gases. The average sub-Saharan African emits less than 1 tonne of carbon dioxide each year. The average American emits over 20 tonnes per year. In the absence of significant economic change in these countries, this would imply that 182 additional North Americans could have a much bigger impact on the global climate than 2.5 additional billion Africans would. So we have to be careful when we think about projecting into the future what the environmental impact of these changing populations are. It could be that rather than the population change having the biggest impact on the world's climate or other environmental processes or other sustainability issues, it could be it's the standard of living that is the most important. So if we see increases in consumption to match these increases in population, that's when we will see the need for new forms of energy, improved improved ways to deal with pollution such as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So population growth may not be the horror it could be. Population growth rates are decreasing, and they are on track to stabilise this century. It might in fact be that for environmental sustainability, consumption patterns have a much more bigger impact than population change will. There are some problems that are not resolving themselves, however. In the next week's set of lectures, we'll talk about an entire class of problems known as tragedy of the commons. And this explains why things such as the global atmosphere, the world's fisheries, or even the shared bathroom down the hall are not in the state we might wish them to be.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.